Well, the Starship program has suffered another explosion. Seasoned tank watchers out there will know that this is far from the first time something like this has happened, but what happens next? There are perhaps more questions up in the air now than there were parts of Ship 36 during its untimely demise. How long will the rebuild take? What does this mean for Flight 10? What effect, if any, will this have on Block 3, the next version of Starship? Is there any chance SpaceX can make its timelines for Artemis and Mars missions? And perhaps most importantly, just how many explosions is too many? Howdy, friends. I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update, SAT Edition. By now, you've probably already heard about what's suspected to have caused Ship 36's explosion, when it happened, and what was supposed to be happening that day instead of, a rapid unscheduled disassembly. If not, you should probably watch the latest episode of This Week in Spaceflight. It neatly summarizes all of that info, and if you want even more, you can watch this week's Flame Trench, where we sort of decompress and talk through everything. But This Week in Spaceflight is a general news show, and the Flame Trench is sort of a director's cut. This is Starbase Update. So now, with the benefit of a little bit of time having passed and looking over all of the info that we have at hand, there is something better that we can do. We can take a look at all the footage carefully and line up what we can see with everything that's come out since the explosion. We know from Elon and the official SpaceX update on the company's website that a nitrogen composite overwrap pressure vessel, or COPV, located inside the nose cone was likely at fault for the explosion. Inside the nose cone, there are lots of these COPVs, so where exactly was the suspect one? Well, the nose cone has two small propellant tanks, one for liquid oxygen right at the tip of the nose, and then another one for liquid methane underneath it. To hold the methane tank to the nose cone, there's an inverted conical frustrum that is welded to the nose cone and sort of holds the methane tank together. It is on this inverted conical frustrum that a bunch of COPVs are installed. But those aren't the only ones inside the nose cone. Those two header tanks have transfer tubes that transfer their contents from the header tanks down to each of the main tanks. The methane header tank leads to the main methane tank, and the liquid oxygen header tank, you guessed it, leads to the main liquid oxygen tank. These transfer tubes run down the ship on the windward side. That's the belly of the ship, the side with the heat shield. This is so that when the ship is in its belly flop maneuver, the propellant from the header tanks naturally flows down through those transfer tubes. Why is this important? Well, we can see on this shot from Ship 35's payload bay during Flight 9 that there are what appears to be about 6 COPVs on each side of the header tank transfer tubes. This would be on top of the ones we just said are located on the frustrum much further up the nose cone. If we take a look where the initial burst happened, we can see that it takes place not near the tip of the nose cone, but slightly further down. And on top of that, it happens on the heat shield side of the ship. This means that the COPV at fault was most likely one of those 12 COPVs around the header tank transfer tubes. We can even go one step further and see that the initial burst happened on the right-hand side of the ship when looking at it from the leeward side. This means that it had to be one of the 6 COPVs to the right of the transfer tubes that we can see on the Ship 35 internal view from Flight 9. Now that we have a better understanding of where exactly the anomaly may have originated, the big question, not just for us, but also for SpaceX, is to find out why it happened. I mean, COPVs don't just blow up like that. There must have been a reason why it failed below its rated pressure. SpaceX has had a COPV burst issue before on Falcon 9, but the circumstances under which that happened were very unique and complex, and it took months to figure out that exact failure mechanism. It could have been a simple mishandling, an issue with the testing flow, a quality control issue from the vendor, or it could have been a sort of Swiss cheese model of a bunch of small separate events that led to the COPV bursting. What's more is that depending on the initial problem, the anomaly could have happened absurdly fast, meaning it could take very careful interpretation of the data they have to find out exactly what happened. For example, that Falcon 9 COPV failure we were talking about a moment ago was Amos 6. SpaceX said at the time that from the first signs of an anomaly to the loss of data was just 93 milliseconds. On a 30 frame per second camera, for example, that would just be a couple of frames, and it would literally be a blink and you miss it situation. If SpaceX is dealing with similar timescales here, they've certainly got their work cut out for them. So yeah, Ship 36 exploded. It's super unfortunate, but there's no sense in crying over spilled locks. Let's look at what matters, and that is what's next. Apart from the complex investigation that is doubtlessly already underway, SpaceX is also now starting to clear and clean up the Massey Outpost, the test site where the explosion happened. Don't listen to the mainstream media who says it blew up on the launch pad. Just not true. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, officials from the emergency services rushed to the scene to manage the situation, but unfortunately, with all the potential methane still left in the ground storage tanks, it was probably not really safe for them to approach. So that meant the only option at the time was to just let the fire burn until there wasn't anything else left to burn, which would essentially mean it extinguishes itself naturally. Luckily, it's been kind of rainy the last few days, so that likely helped a bit. The main source of the fires after the immediate explosion seemed to be coming from the vaporizers that are used at the Massey Outpost for chill down of methane, and it's likely that these still had methane flowing through them at the time of the explosion, mostly because propellant load, while being close to done, was still ongoing. If that was the case, then the ground tanks would keep feeding the fire in those vaporizers and whatever other transfer lines were being used at the time until all the methane in them was burned. In hindsight, that probably saved SpaceX from any further explosions as the methane burned slowly overnight rather than cooking off in a big blast. A day after the explosion, the US Coast Guard released a notice to mariners placing a 1 nautical mile safety zone around the side of the Rio Grande next to the Massey Outpost. The notice said that, quote, "A 6 by 2 feet COPV has been reported along the riverbank in the Rio Grande River on the US side, approximately 700 feet from the Massey test site," end quote. And later warning, quote, "Mariners are urged to avoid the area," end quote. So if you're in the area, be mindful of this and don't approach Massey's too close until it's deemed safe. While that restriction was placed on the American side of the Rio Grande River next to the Massey Outpost, the road to the site, called Massey Way, was also closed to the general public, at least as of the time of this recording. On Friday, the site finally appeared to be open to SpaceX employees, but again, as of recording on Saturday, there remains a roadblock at the intersection of Highway 4 and Massey Way. So far, the only people that have been able to drive up Massey Way have been SpaceX employees, who were probably among the first to be there in order to assess the risk and later to begin cleanup operations. That cleanup has already started, in fact, and we've seen at least one crane going around the site and starting to lift pieces up from the ground, likely from the ship or damaged ground support equipment. Now, I've talked before about the investigation that SpaceX must already be doing in light of this incident, but some of you may be asking, doesn't the FAA also need to get involved in this? Well, yes and no. It's very likely that, just like in many previous accident investigations, SpaceX will ask for expert help from the FAA, NASA, or even the Space Force. We've seen that happen in the past. But no, a formal mishap investigation for the FAA is not needed because these pre-launch operations are not licensed under the FAA. It just doesn't make sense to ask for an investigation for an operation where the FAA isn't involved. It's as if you had an accident while driving to the airport and now the FAA had to be involved because you were going to the airport. It just doesn't make sense. One other thing that has happened in the aftermath of the Ship 36 explosion was the removal and rollback of Booster 16's hot staging ring from Mega Bay 1. This hot staging ring had rolled out on Monday, June 16th in preparation for what was going to be an upcoming Flight 10, but of course now that's off the table. It was going to be such a nice Starbase update this week, with the hot staging ring roll, 2 static fires, the June 29th launch date being posted by the FAA, the talk about whether Flight 10 might happen that day or not, and now, well, we're all still wondering when Flight 10 might happen. I guess at least that hasn't changed. SpaceX now has a complicated situation on their hands after this explosion, and not just because they'll have to figure out exactly what happened, but also because the Massey test site suffered extensive damage and they don't have a replacement. That means there needs to be not just a cleanup, but also a repair and restoration of the site. That process may take longer or shorter depending on various factors. The first is obviously the amount of damage taken by the hardware at the Massey Outpost. From these aerial shots taken by Jerry with his drone the morning after the explosion, we can see that a lot of the plumbing has been burned and the service structure next to the static fire stand is just simply a mess of mangled metal. Images by me made on Sunday, closer to the test site, show the scope of the damage done to all of the hardware immediately next to the ship at the time of the explosion. Needless to say, that service structure is done for, and SpaceX is going to need to build a new one. Several of the tanks closer to the ship, which are used for water deluge, are also blackened by the explosion and subsequent fire. And although they seem to still be in one piece, there's no way to guarantee that they can still safely hold water at pressure. Similarly, the methane side of the tank farm was burned up as well, which I guess is to be expected given the fires burning overnight. The vaporizers are essentially destroyed, and at the time Jerry's shots were taken, we can see, in fact, some hardware is still smoldering from the fire. You know what's also smoldering? This intense heat of summer! Wouldn't it be nice to wear some cool gear during this infernal weather? We got you covered here at NSF with our summer collection. Just this past June 20th, we entered the summer season here in the Northern Hemisphere, meaning longer days and shorter nights. But space-themed shorts and Hawaiian shirts are even better. Go to shop.nasaspaceflight.com and check them out. They're very nice and comfy to wear, whether you're in the scorching heat of Ship 36's Fireball or just the comfort of your home and hopefully AC. And if you're down in the southern hemisphere, we're not forgetting about you either, because we also have sweatshirts as part of the collection, so you can await the summer in comfy apparel and style with our super heavy swim club gear. Okay, back to Massey's. If we look further away from where the ship was standing just the day before these pictures were taken, we can see that there's a tent that has burned down, and some of the hardware for the new booster cryogenic stand has been damaged as well. The extent of the damage seemed to be pretty much all the way down south to where the structural test stand and the booster 18.1 test tank are located. So, given all of this, how long do we think it'll take for Massey's to be back up and running? Well, as mentioned before, the amount of damage sustained is just one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is whether SpaceX has the parts needed to either replace the destroyed hardware, and how much, if anything, they can repair rather than replace. It's very likely that for some things, like cryogenic piping and whatnot, SpaceX will have spares, or at least ground support equipment they can repurpose already laying around. You just have to take one look at the Sanchez lot and you'll see loads of little cryogenic pipes stored on those shelves they use to store things there, so maybe they can use some of those as spares. At the Sanchez lot, they also have a spare ship umbilical port as well, so perhaps that won't be much of an issue either. The damaged vaporizers may also be easy to replace. They probably have some in storage as spares after they brought over a dozen of them for the side of the tank farm feeding the second Starship launch pad at Starbase. Maybe a bigger issue could be finding new tanks to change those out that might be damaged, as those aren't really easy to get on a whim. There also may be other long lead items such as electrical control rooms and other pieces of specialized hardware that will take longer to source. Unless, of course, SpaceX has some spares around, in which case it won't be that much of a problem. Another issue might also be staffing, since to the best of our knowledge, there were no planned major changes coming for Massey's. We do expect some small changes, and we'll talk about those a bit later in the video, but certainly nothing needing a full rebuild. That means SpaceX may need to pull in some contractors and personnel from sites such as the second launch pad in Starbase, Launch Complex 39A in Florida, or even McGregor and Hawthorne or Vandenberg. It's likely to be an all-hands-on-deck affair either way. I mentioned Launch Complex 39A in Florida specifically because right now they're putting together a Starship launch pad there. So there's probably a bunch of people working there that have enough expertise to also be useful to help the Massey rebuild. I also mentioned McGregor because right now they're in the process of putting together new test stands there, which would most likely have people working on them and thus people with knowledge that could also aid the Massey rebuild. Of course, not everyone on those projects are needed, but I wouldn't be surprised if, say, a few Florida engineers got called that night at 4 a.m. to get ready to head to Starbase and help with Massey repairs. So now in terms of Flight 10, the question is if the repair work will be done soon enough that it makes logical sense to fly the next ship in line, Ship 37. In an alternative universe, I'd be a very happy Jack giving a magnificent Starbase update where Ship 36 got static fired successfully and rolled back to Mega Bay 2 for launch preparations. And that Jack would be very happy to say that Ship 37 might have gotten engines this week, and that would mean that SpaceX is preparing for a quick turnaround between Flight 10 and 11, since that ship could have been going to Massey's for static fire testing right after Flight 10. Unfortunately, we're in the timeline where Ship 37 did seem to get engines, but Ship 36 blew up and destroyed most of the static fire hardware at Massey Outpost. Yes, just the day before Ship 36 exploded, we saw at least one engine going into Mega Bay 2, which likely means that Ship 37 was getting its engine since it's already completed cryogenic proof testing. But with the explosion damaging a lot of equipment at the Massey Outpost, this means that there's not going to be any rapid turnaround because there's currently no way for this ship to get tested until Massey's is back up and running. It's also very likely that SpaceX can't even cryoproof the next ship, Ship 38, as we would be expecting by now, because some of the cryoproof hardware was damaged as well. It was not as damaged as the static fire stand though, so perhaps the cryostation can be returned back to service sooner and get that testing done as early as possible. It'll just depend on what sort of priority SpaceX will have, whether to focus entirely on repairing the static fire stand, or if they try and spread the work across the entire facility to bring it back up to service in entirety. So now that we've looked at pretty much every single thing that could potentially affect the return of Massey's and where the next ships are in their flow, we may be waiting at least a couple of months to see things coming back on track. I'd wager that by mid-August, things will start to normalize. But again, all of this is depending on SpaceX repairing Massey's and returning it back to testing Block 2 ships. But what if they don't do that? What if, maybe, they just move on to Block 3. Think about it. Block 3 ships and boosters are already in manufacturing at the production site. Booster 18's liquid oxygen tank has nearly completed stacking, so only the methane tank should be left to build. Ship 39's sections are almost certainly scattered around the Star Factory and getting prepared to be stacked inside Mega Bay 2 sometime soon. At some point, the Massey Outpost would have had to get modified hardware in support of Block 3 Starship and booster. We have, in fact, already seen modifications being done to the booster cryostation to adapt it for Block 3 boosters, which will have 2 quick disconnect ports instead of 1. The static fire stand would also have had to be modified once Block 2 ships finished their testing, and the same goes for the ship cryostation. Is it worthwhile to repair the static fire stand for Block 2 when there's only 2 remaining Block 2 ships? I mean, this is not even a question about whether SpaceX should keep flying Block 2 or not, or whether Block 2 is flawed. That's a whole separate thing. This is about what would be a better use of time. Why expend the effort and work hours on an outdated design when you can just move on to Block 3? Well, there are caveats here. The first one is that there's no guarantees that Block 3 vehicles will be ready soon, just because we're seeing them progressing through the manufacturing phase. The first vehicle of a new design also always has teething problems and may very well have some delays to its readiness. Also, stacking or building barrel sections for these vehicles does not mean the vehicles are anywhere close to ready, even for proof testing or static fire testing, for example. On top of that, Block 3 vehicles would need Raptor 3 to be ready to fly, and there's also no guarantee that the new engine is ready to go just yet. There may not even be a proper production and cadence yet to supply a whole stack, given that the highest Raptor 3 serial number we've seen so far has been 23 over at SpaceX's McGregor test site. There's also the second pad at Starbase, Pad B or Pad 2 or whatever you want to call it. That still needs to be worked on and completed before any rocket launches from there, and that's the only pad currently at Starbase being built with Block 3 in mind. Lastly, not flying the remaining Block 2 ships would likely remove 2 opportunities at gathering even more data that was probably crucial to making Block 3, well, not have as much bad luck as Block 2. In summary, I think it makes sense to do the least amount of work possible at Massey's in order to get it back up and running in support of Block 2 hardware. During this rebuild, SpaceX could repair and retrofit everything they need to adjust for Block 3 with some minor affordances to allow for testing of the remaining Block 2 ships. Sort of a best of both worlds scenario. Do you agree? Is this even possible? You know the drill. Sound off in the comments. There's also another piece of the puzzle to consider, and that is Booster 18.1. This test tank was at the Massey Outpost at the time of Ship 36's explosion, and in case you forgot, it's supposed to be there to test and validate the aft section of Block 3 boosters, including their new header tank design. It had already undergone a few tests while on the structural test stand, but was seemingly not at the end of its test campaign, especially given that some of the hydraulic rams had only just been hooked up. SpaceX almost certainly needed more data out of this test article. If that's the case, then that too can delay the debut of Block 3. There's also the fact that the booster cryostation that was undergoing upgrades for Block 3 seems to have been damaged as well, so perhaps that could also contribute to potential delays. Either way, it's very clear that Flight 10 won't be coming anytime soon, whether it comes in Block 2 form or Block 3 form. I still think it'll happen this year, depending on what route SpaceX takes, and heck, it may even happen before the summer is over if they really work their butts off to get Massey's back into shape. But the next month or so at least is going to be one featuring the grind of the rebuild. Even if they're flying again by, say, August? That's already quite late into the year, isn't it? How will this affect the future schedules that they did have? 2025 promised to be a transitional year for Starship, where the rocket was going to get bigger, better, improve its reliability, and it was going to do even crazier things. A few of the things we were looking forward to at the beginning of the year, for example, were super heavy reuse, proving operations for future orbital missions by doing things such as in-space engine relights with Block 2, the deployment of Starlink simulators, and later on even the first ship catch. Heck, even Elon thought that there was a chance of perhaps reusing a ship in 2025 as well. But with Flights 7, 8, and 9 seeing their ships fail early on, we really only had one of those achieved, and that was the booster reuse milestone. Super Heavy really has surprised a lot of us with how much better it has performed, but at the end of the day, it's just the vehicle that pushes the ship near space and gives it a little boost. The real deal, the real challenge of the Starship program is getting the ship into space and then doing things with it. Things like, say, landing a human on the moon for the first time since Apollo? SpaceX has had a contract with NASA to land humans on the moon with Starship for Artemis 3. That mission since December of last year has been listed with a mid-2027 date, but with now nearly 6 months of very little progress towards full orbital flights in 2025, that might not be the case anymore. Given the fact that even Elon now says that orbital refilling won't be tested until 2026, SpaceX would really have to go into turbo mode next year to meet that deadline. And that's just Artemis alone. There's also SpaceX's own Mars program. The company has been targeting the end of 2026 for the first Starships to fly to Mars for a while now. That's because that's when the planetary launch window is set to open. Just like with the human landing system though, this too would need SpaceX to go into turbo mode and really ramp their operations in 2026 in order to meet their own milestones. Given all that's occurred now with Ship 36, it's probably unrealistic to expect all of that to play out with no alterations. I personally think Artemis 3 could still hit 2028, and I do think that we could see starships headed to Mars during the next transfer window. The question I have now is, how robust will these missions be? I think we all hope they'd be more on the operational side of things, but it's becoming clear that they too, like all of the flights so far, will probably be somewhat risky test flights, whenever they do happen. Of course, it's still early days, and we'll surely learn a lot more and form a better picture of the situation in the coming weeks and months. This next section is probably going to be the one that will get us the most haters, but here we go. Everything goes back to one central question that we get all the time in our comments, which is that version 2 is not good, that it should be thrown out, and people think that they should move on to block 3, and so on and so forth. I guess they're more statements than questions, but you get my point. I mean, I understand it. How many explosions are too many? Block 2 was supposed to be more reliable. Even Elon said as much prior to Block 2 debuting, so I mean, another promise broken, am I right? And now, with all these failures, it seems like SpaceX hasn't made any progress in 2025, and we just talked about that a minute ago. But when you look back at all of the failures that have happened, the only one we can pinpoint so far on Block 2's design is the one on Flight 7 and the harmonic resonance issue. Flight 8 was a hardware issue on a Raptor, and Ship 36 was due to COPVs on the payload bay area, which were also there on Block 1. In the case of Flight 9, we still don't know exactly what caused the tank leak that led to loss of control of the ship because SpaceX hasn't released any of that info yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that too had nothing to do with a Block 2 specific design. Also, moving on to Block 3 won't guarantee that ship's issues will just suddenly magically disappear. It may very well have new design issues on its own, given that it's introducing new systems and changing part of the plumbing once again. I really think people aren't considering that Block 3 will simultaneously be an improvement, but also likely suffer its own teething issues. Certainly you could say Block 2 is cursed, especially if you're superstitious, but I don't agree that it's fundamentally flawed per se. A whole different topic is whether the various stakeholders in the Starship program will keep tolerating these explosions. I mean, as a viewer and a spaceflight enthusiast, it sucks to see this happen, and I bet the teams at SpaceX don't like it either. But we understand that this is mostly par for the course. Anomalies are just a thing in the rocket industry, not just at SpaceX. Issues from small to big happen all the time, but some are more public and visible than others. As long as NASA, the DoD, and private equity continues to understand that, SpaceX should be okay. I do worry about the optics of this though, and events like it, opening the door to backroom lobbying in various places, Washington DC, and what sort of catastrophic possibilities could result from that. Just since we started our channel, outside of Starship, there's been numerous explosions and accidents we've covered across the spaceflight industry. Even live, Alpha has exploded, ULA blew up a Centaur, Northrop dropped a Cygnus, the list goes on. We can even go back to the 1960s when even the iconic Saturn V had one of its upper stages exploding on the test stand during testing, and that was supposed to be flying humans just a year later. Now sure, SpaceX has 9 flights into Starship's full-stack test campaign, but nobody said these vehicles are done testing, or that SpaceX is done changing their designs. It will, though, most likely shift all schedules to the right. And hey, who hasn't had delays in their spaceflight programs? Raise your hand. I don't want to see anybody raising their hand. Everybody's had delays. Falcon 9 suffered 2 major explosions early in its career, one in June 2015 during flight, and another on the pad in September of 2016. And they were actually flying real payloads at the time. They lost hundreds of millions of dollars in NASA cargo and also hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of a communications satellite. That's not a problem they have with Starship. And despite that, SpaceX was launching humans for the first time less than 4 years after that latter event. So while, yeah, it's super unfortunate and the public image is not good, there's no reason to panic. Perhaps the question is not whether there are just too many issues because design bad or SpaceX bad, but maybe it's an issue of rushing. Maybe it's the pressure of trying to hit all the deadlines we just talked about earlier. It's a lot easier, for example, to damage a COPV while you're preparing a ship if you're an engineer that has been tasked with getting stuff done as quickly as possible, hours worked or schedules be damned. As I said a little bit ago, surely in the coming weeks and months, we'll get more clarity as to what happened and what is going to be the fix. Of course, I'm hoping that things improve and that we see successes going forward. We all want to see humanity reach out into the solar system and eventually the stars. And while this week was a bummer, ideally, it'll just be a footnote in the history books when the story of Starship is written. You know, I normally ask y'all to let us know what you think in the comments, but I'm sure I don't have to say anything this week because the comment section is probably already boiling hot with your takes. If you have reached this part of the episode, comment bacon to let me know you resisted the temptation to comment until now, and then you can say whatever you want. All right, that's going to be it for this week. Hopefully we'll have lots of great news to talk about on next week's Starbase update, but until then, thanks for watching, and don't forget, be excellent to each other.